started. Up on the screen, you see a GitHub repository. And these slides are also available on the Sketch page. So you can either download the slides and click on the link, or just type that URL in, and you'll get a repository for this workshop. And in the repository for the workshop, on the landing page, there is a README, and it goes over what we're going to do here today. And in this workshop, we're going to be using Python, XSL, and all wrapped up in a Jupyter notebook to determine if metadata collections contain the concepts that a metadata record would need to be fair. And as we've talked about in other sessions today, what is fair is based on the user. So in this workshop, what we're going to do is give you an opportunity to build your own recommendation of fair for your own metadata standard. It's my hope that we can work together and build on this morning's session in perhaps a more operational way. When we do create that recommendation, we will be able to load that into a Jupyter notebook along with metadata records of your choice and generate a report and a visualization of the completeness or fairness of that metadata collection for your community's users' needs. So a catalog's purpose is to help users to find, access, interoperate, and reuse the data. And to be good stewards, curators have to do this effectively and equitably so that the catalog's resources are valid throughout the life cycle for the users of that catalog. And since there are a wide variety of ways that people study the earth, there are almost as many different ways that they structure their metadata. And these different standards have different recommendations or information needs for what their users require and need from their metadata. And these shape the records that are created by a discipline. So how can curators for earth science data sets and other resources include an understanding of the variety of information needs that their users are going to have and create actionable curation workflows to address these varying needs to ensure fairness for any of their potential users. And like I say, we can generate reports based on automation so that we can continue to look at how fair the records in our catalog are. When you have a discipline-specific curation for a catalog, you may serve the users that are from that discipline, but you might not be able to provide the information that someone from outside that discipline needs in order to understand and use that data. And since this idea of quality is subjective for metadata, the needs of the user are paramount. So for equitable discovery and access, the documentation use cases or recommendations of the originating discipline are necessary, but they're not sufficient. We need to be able to look at our catalog in many different ways in order to provide all of the information to serve the information needs of all of our potential users and not just the people that are subject specific. So we can create reports, and in these reports we can identify the concepts that are missing from the standard or the collection, which ones are complete or partially used. So here we've got red for concepts that don't exist in a dialect, yellow for things that are in the dialect or standard but not in the collection, green for something that's present in every record, and then just a percentage for things that are present in some of the records. So then we can generate a more complex report to compare between versions of catalogs so that we can see and show our progress, perhaps over time to funders or other people who are interested in that kind of progress. There's some difficulty in using typical visualizations to do this when you're looking at every metadata concept in a recommendation. So you can't really understand the whole picture when you're using a bar chart or parallel lines. So the visualization that we're going to create today looks at a metadata record as a key, and the lock as the information needs. So in a lock, you have a bunch of pins that correspond to the tines on a key. And if you can, push all of those pins with your key, then you unlock the information from that data. So the visualization that we're going to create is a radar plot. And each of these lines is a concept or an element in that recommendation. And we can plot from 0 to 1 to show how complete or not a concept is in the recommendation. And this gives us a quick way to look at whether a collection is going to meet those information needs, in this case, whether it's going to be fair for our users. And then we can use that to show improvement over time or to compare between different versions of the catalog. So back to the GitHub repo README, we have a section called Workshop, and if you click on the link there, you're going to open up a Google product called Collaboratory, and Collaboratory is a Jupyter environment. And in that environment, we're going to run a notebook that allows us to evaluate our metadata for content using XSL, and then using Python, we'll be able to create a recommendation and then analyze the evaluation of our metadata using that recommendation, and then generate the reports and visualizations. So does everyone have the Collaboratory open? Just raise your hand if you don't have it yet. The link is in the GitHub repository, and that link is github.com/scgordon/mile4fairness. Again, here's the URL. So once you have Collaboratory open, it'll be helpful to click on this little chevron on the left. It's going to show a table of contents for the workbook and also show files that are in your Collaboratory. I am actually going to. So you should have a screen that shows your notebook and then shows a file browser on the left-hand side. And you should just see a directory in there called sample data. So the first step is to set up our Collaboratory environment. And we're going to do this using a series of shell scripts, bash commands, and in Jupyter you just use an exclamation point to denote that it's going to be a shell command rather than Python or whatever the environment that you're using is. So really all we have to do here is press play, and you're going to see a thing that says this notebook was not authored by Google. It's fine. I wrote it. You can run anyway, and can reset the runtime. That's just resetting the environment. And so that's going to spin for a while. And what it's going to do is it is going to clone that repository that you were in. And that means that it's going to download all of the files into this Collaboratory environment. And then you're going to install a few things that Collab doesn't come with. Once you've got all that stuff together, it's going to take a few moments. So we're rebuilding some stuff and putting in new versions of things that are necessary. If you're going to do this at home later on and you want to use your own environment, your own Jupyter, whether that's on a server or your local machine, there are instructions in the README on how to set that stuff up there. Once we're there, we're going to want to change the context of where we are in the directory structure to that GitHub repository that we just downloaded and into the notebooks directory. And then once we're there, we'll be able to navigate properly. So in the next cell, there are a couple of lines that are commented out. You can select either. I would suggest for this first round, just selecting the first one, and that's going to download some sample metadata. And that's going to give us a few EML collections from the Andrews Forest, which is an LTER site. So in this cell, there are two commented out lines, and the comment out just means that there's a hash mark in front of the line. So just take one of those away. And then you will have a new directory with some metadata records in it. And so once we've got metadata, then we need to prepare the actual notebook environment. And so here we're just importing some Python modules and making a directory and setting a variable. So here, again, we just press play. We import these different Python modules from the collaboratory environment, and then we import one Python script from the notebook directory, and that's something that I wrote so that most of the code isn't on your screen, and it's just over here in this file. Then we're making a directory for the data that we create, and then we are looking inside that collection directory that we just created for the LTR metadata, and we're just going to grab all the names of that and stick that into a variable so that we can reuse this repository with any metadata that we would like to have. So then we need to have a recommendation to apply to that evaluated metadata. And to do that, I've just set up a simple dictionary. And a dictionary is a series of keys and value pairs. So here, the keys are going to be the XPath, and then the value is just something that we would like to label that with. So that could be, in this case, it's the EML element, but you could use a metadata concept name, such as is done in the Data One FAIR quality check suites. So we're going to run that dictionary. Now, once we have that dictionary, we want to evaluate our metadata. So here, I have loaded into the repository a Saxon parser of XML, and that's going to allow us to create a flat CSV of the XPath, the directory name, the file name, and the content of that XPath, of that XML element. So it has in it not only that this is the author, but this is the author. So if I wrote a record, my name would show up in the information that we're going to extract from the metadata. So that's going to run against every record in every collection. And it will generate a CSV, gzipped CSV over in the data directory for each of those collections. Once that's done, then we don't have to mess around with XML or XSL anymore. We can go directly into Python and use pandas as our data analysis tool. So here we are going to be looking for occurrence of those specific XPaths that are in the Python dictionary that we created. And then we're going to run that. It's going to create some more CSVs with specific aspects of the information in the evaluated CSV that we created from the XML. Once we have that, then we can create a report. And that report is going to have all of the elements that exist in those XML collections, and then all of the elements that are in the recommendation, and then we're going to take the most used element in each of those collections that satisfies that that recommendation, and create a much shorter list. And with that much shorter list, then we'll create the visualization with that. So we're going to give recommendation a name. And then we are going to rub our hands together and hope that generating this report works. And once that wheel stops spinning, we will see a link appear at the bottom. And I would suggest right-clicking on that link, because Collaboratory tries to open up that Google Sheet within that cell, and it is quite hard to see. So we open that in a new tab, and using another Google product, here we have a report on how fair those collections are. And as you see, they are of varying completeness. Now, these collections are all from the same LTER site from different years. So this is representing how fair that site's collection of metadata records that they created that year was. And you can see in some elements, they don't use it. In some, they have a much greater use in later years than they did earlier on. But you can see that it is trending towards much more complete. And I think that these visualizations are actually backwards here. Not quite sure why that is, but anyway, if you look at the average completeness percentage, which is in the second row, you can see that over time, they have actually become more fair. And this is from 2014, so just a couple of years before FAIR came out, until just a couple of years after FAIR came out. And even though they're not specifically trying to get these elements that have been determined as fair, they actually have been becoming more fair. And as Margaret was talking about in the last session, it is because they have a system that sets up automated checks and helps their users to create metadata records of such a structure that they contain all of the elements that they find important. So when you set up these automated checking systems, you can change the conversation within a community such that they create records that are more usable by a wider audience. So, and then the other tabs in here show all of the elements that satisfy those conditions that we set up in that Python dictionary. And you can see, how many collections have that thing in it, how many collections have it completely in it, how many are partial. Up top, you can see that, there's the number of records, the number of elements, and then what kind of focus that particular collection had on the elements in the recommendation. And that final page is everything that exists in those records. So if the report generates an outcome and metadata provider says, hey, but wait, I included that concept in my records, you can go to this page and say, show me where. And then you can get that XPath and then you can improve your recommendation. So what I would like to do for this workshop is to do a little bit more what we were going towards this morning. But instead of looking at issues and determining whether things are right or should be changed, I would like to get a little bit more operational. And there is a link under Create a Fair Recommendation Together that leads you to a Google Doc. And this is the active part of the workshop session. So I would suggest that we all come together for a discussion. And here I have set up a few links to different metadata standards. So if you came here and you are working at USGS, you can look at the CSDGM glossary to get XPaths to create a dictionary. If you're using DataCite, there's DataCite, EML, ISO, and then I've got a couple of example dictionaries here. One is in EML. Yes. In the notebook, there's a link under the Create a Fair Recommendation Together section. And if you have that left-hand side tab open, you can open the table of contents and look for Create a Fair Recommendation Together. So at this point, I would like you to think about what makes a record fair for your community. How can we identify what are the essential metadata concepts for fairness in the ESIP community? And if we can get a dictionary of those XPaths together, if we all wanted to work together on one aspect of FAIR for one metadata standard and identify the essentials, then we can run that against your own metadata. We can run that against the sample collections that I've provided. We can really do whatever you would like. So there is in the repository a notebook for collecting your own records. There's a function in the Python script that I put in there that allows you to download directly from a repository. You can go into the repository in the file view. You can right click on collection and upload directly from your computer. So there are a wide variety of ways that you can get the metadata in. If you have it in a GitHub repository, you can git clone directly into that collection directory. So there are a wide variety of ways for you to play with this workshop notebooks after or right now. So what aspect of FAIR would you guys like to work on? Do we want to stick with findable? Do we want to talk about accessible, interoperable, reusable? Interoperable, all right. So what metadata standard? Who uses EML in their daily work? Anybody? ISO? Any other standards? Okay, so looks like more people work with ISO than any other standard. While it is completely possible to generate the reports with JSON, I don't have that set up in this workbook or notebook. So I would suggest not using UMM. So yeah, so it would take writing a function that creates that CSV that I create from the XML. Once you have that, then you could just drop it in, plug and play, because it's really easy to look for a JSON vocabulary word, much easier than an XPath, particularly an ISO XPath. But it looks like ISO is the expertise here. So let's see. There is another repository. Let me find that, and then I'll drop the link in. Okay, so on that Google Doc now is a link to a CSV that we've been putting together for the Metadig quality engine. And the categories column has a letter that corresponds to the aspect of FAIR. So it looks like rows 24 through 31 are interoperable. So let's look at those and see if there are any other ISO elements that we would like to add, or whether we think that these cover everything. Personally, I am a little bit less familiar with ISO than I am with EML. And I do know, though, that I don't believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that ISO doesn't have a long name for parameters. In this CSV, if you scroll over to the XPath column, we don't have anything there. So if you do know an XPath that would correspond to a long name for a parameter, we could stick that in and make a contribution. And if you notice, the XPaths here for ISO have been stripped of their namespaces. That won't work in the dictionary that I have because they're looking through, yes. Yeah. So all we are looking for is just, it can even be just a unique section of an ISO XPath. So it can be any flavor. It can be 19115. It can be 19115-2. Could even be -1, although I don't have any -1 records uploaded. But if you have -1, then you can set up a dictionary that will look through and find those XPaths. And then the second sample dictionary is the ISO one that I started. So all you would have to do to improve that would be to go to the bottom, add a comma, just return it and tab over, and then you just need to have quotes. Yes? You're talking about the Metadata checks CSV? Yeah, all we're doing is existence checks, not anything more complex than that. Because to build a more complex check on the content, you first need to identify where that content is going to be in a record. So our thought was, if we identify the place within the structure where that information is going to be, once we've identified that, then we can write more complex checks that will say, something about what that content should have in it or how it should be structured. But within the metadata quality engine, which is separate than the workflow in this notebook, you can check for an XPath and then write some Python or R code that provides a more complex assessment of the content at that location in the structure. So has anyone seen any other elements that could go under interoperability?
Yeah. So the 19115 is pretty awkward when it comes to talking about like tabular data and parameters. And so like when thinking about things in terms of tables, like the parameter name, like the sections described here, is for like a coverage content stuff, which I think maps really poorly onto like most of the data sets that I think about.
Mm-hmm.
So when we create ISO, we end up using the 19110 feature catalog and creating like any attributes in there.
Okay.
So I would put some of those like attribute labels, attribute names, attribute definitions, attribute like there's a lot of things that map more analogously, and I would put a lot of these in here, but it does sort of broaden the scope of fair. Yeah, what you can look at to decide something's fair.
Well, but if those things are what are necessary for that data to be interoperable, then you know, like I was saying, you know, how LTR has discovered when you make something more apparent, you know, or its absence more apparent, you tend to shift the community's practice towards including those things.
It's been a real pain historically in the short history of ISO. Because the 19110 is a separate record, so it's like most repositories written, you know, how to like put that information up on the landing page and account, it's a separate record, right? It's a separate style sheet. But with the dash one, now embed that all of the content from the dash one from the 19110 inside your 19115.
Couldn't you do that just by adding the additional namespaces?
I don't think so, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm not real revelation.
Well, I mean, I'm not an ISO expert by any means, but there are definitely standards out there that allow you to, um, you know, stick doubling core inside of a mods record, for example. So, you know, the flexibility exists in XML, you know, to go ahead and add those additional elements in. It's a question of whether that flexibility exists in ISO, but I thought that it did. But you're saying in either case in dash one,
Yeah,
that's
it's now.
okay.
I didn't know how to validate the
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the reasons why a business community has moved away from XML, you know, and dragging the earth science community along towards that, you know, forward thinking from NASA in particular has us moving towards JSON and away from XML. So we've got Ted joining us. Right now we are looking at interoperability and determining whether or not there are additional ISO paths that we could add in here. And we are talking about feature catalogs. So if you could get Ted up to speed on what you were just saying about how that can increase your interoperability.
Sure. So I guess it begins with like the 19115 is a little bit awkward for most like the basic tagging, you know. And so the way that we have been using it, I think is the right way based on that, is like understanding the standard. Put that into the feature catalog, naturally there, even though they're not features. So incorporating some of those 19110 XPaths into these checkers for fairness could make that data look a lot more fair.
And you were talking interoperability,
Yeah.
parameter names and units and stuff like that?
Yep.
Yeah.
But he was saying that the issue then is that you have to check through two records, basically.
Are you using dash one or just 19115?
Well, we're still using 19115. We would like to move to dash one when we talk to folks at the CEI and data one. And for the conflict dash one, yeah, like put the brakes on. We'd like to, then that's also the problem.
It's what?
Well, then you can dash one, right? You can embed all the 19110 stuff right in the same method. So we'd like to.
So we're trying to build on the work that we've been doing at the Data One workshop and see if there are any other XPaths that we can add to this. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and the metadata quality engine will allow you to do those checks because you'll be able to say, okay, I'm looking at this point, this location in the structure, and then I'm going to apply something that looks through a controlled vocabulary list and sees if that if that word, that content at that location in the structure corresponds to one of those vocabulary words. So that'll solve that problem, but we just want to find all of the locations within the structure of a document that we need to look at, and then build on that past the idea of just whether something's present or absent. If we don't have anything to add to interoperability, maybe we can look at access or reuse, as we do have quite a bit of checks already for findability. So why don't we just go to access, since that's pretty straightforward. And in access, we have distribution contact, resource distribution, and then a few things about service, the location, the provider, and the type. And these are conceptual names. Like I said earlier, there's the XPath column that'll give the XPaths of those specific things, and we have EML and namespace stripped ISO 19115 paths. That'll cover just straight 19115 as well as -2.
I would also look in the access for the constraints and access for the information field. Maybe there you might have
No, I don't think that we do have that concept. Let's see. On the Google Doc, there's a ISO concepts glossary. And I'm not sure if we have it, but yeah, so there's a metadata use constraints, and there's also a resource use constraints. So I would think that it's probably the resource use constraints that we would want to add to that. So that's fairly easy. We've got a unique string here. So we can just grab that string and go over to that dictionary, that ISO dictionary, and go ahead and add that, and then give it a name. Boom. And now we've got another check that we can add to the report and the visualization should we run ISO collections through the notebook workflow. So now, I don't know, what do you guys think about the resource format? I mean, that it's under interoperability currently as a check, but yeah, but you can still access it, right? I mean, even if you can't use it, you know, even if you can't interoperate with it, you can still download it, right? Regardless of its file type, as long as there aren't constraints on that resource, right? So yeah. So we've now got one more access check, so that's 6. Is there, I mean, do you guys think that access is fairly straightforward, or are there other things that you think that are missing from this?
Well, so I think that like, if you want to be able to comb through metadata and determine if something is accessible, I think that like these are the fields to hit. I think that as a user, obviously I'm going to have I have a lot more questions. And part of it, just knowing what the resource format is, like that's kind of what I want from the check with the metadata. But like she was saying, once I get there, I can use the file type. I'm going to look at what the services are
Right.
available. So there's not much more we can ask for from like this rubric. But there's obviously more complexity.
Well, but remember, this is just a preliminary, like, I mean, it's like a sketch, like very bare bones of the places that we want to look to see if the information needs that we have are going to be able to be met. So if there's some kind of specific content that you want to look at, the first thing to do is to identify where in the document that thing would be. So if there are any other access kinds of content that you want to add to the rubric, then we need to identify where that thing exists before we can assess whether that stuff is going to be usable. So I'm not hearing any other access ideas, and you can pop in any of these levels at any time. But let's go to something that's near and dear to my heart: reuse. We've only got 4 checks here, and I think that we could probably get a little bit more in there if we tried. So let's look at those concepts and see whether there are additional concepts that you think would be useful to reuse. Adding in vertical extent into, is in ISO, is vertical extent something completely different from other spatial extents? I mean, what I'm asking is it a child element?
Vertical extent is a class that is, it's its own actual class within the ISO structure. The temporal extents, geographic extents, and then vertical extents. So time, place, and then where at and goes reaches around space to the depths of the sea.
So then it's a sibling to the spatial extent?
How are we defining spatial extent? Because a spatial extent could be a vertical extent.
Yeah, so what I'm asking from but so but with that extent, look at the would that, I don't know if you guys can read what I have highlighted here, /*/spatial. Would that include vertical extent? Oh, wow. Yeah, I pumped it up, but it's still very small on the screen. Yes. Yeah, so if we have a check that includes a spatial element, then we would pull in any of the vertical extents. And then we could check that vertical extent to see if it was at the bottom of the ocean or, in space. Because it will check at that location and all children of that location. So if there's a sub element of that EX extent or spatial.
Spatial isn't in the EX. I don't know if it's anchored, yes. I don't concur. I'm not sure what element you're actually referencing in the ISO is spatial.
Yeah. Like the first one that comes to me is years extend.
Ted, can you help us out here at all? It's a little tough to read these things with the namespaces stripped out, but the metadata quality engine is a little less complex to configure if you don't include the namespaces in there.
So spatial, I think, is a geographic element. I'm not sure that there is actually the place where spatial, I think, exists is there's a part of the extent class that allows spatial and temporal, a combination of spatial and temporal So if you look at the UML, there's this little classroom hanging out there, that's sort of a cool little, it's sort of a cool little thing, and I suspect that spatial is a rule that comes off of that. I can look at the UML. So it's used in situations where you have spatial and temporal, multiple extents that have spatial and temporal elements that need to be tied to one another. So like if you're doing an experiment in some situation where you have, during one summer, you have, you run an instrument at one location and then you move it, sort of in the fall, maybe you move it to a different place. And, well, that's always a possibility, but some people think about those things as they associate data sets more like with the instruments that collect them. So if you have, like in NOAA, there's a lot of the guys that do like atmospheric LiDAR kind of stuff, and they have an expensive instrument, a LiDAR instrument, and they drive it around to certain places and run it in certain places and times. So you could say, well, I have these 3 different time periods, I have these 3 different locations, but then you don't know which time period goes to which location. So that's what that spatial temporal piece is for. It's to associate, when you have multiple times or locations, it's to associate them with the correct one and not one another. So, I think it's
off of the geographic.
Sorry,
I'm going to get my versions. I'm so confused here because I'm spending a lot of time with the part 1, part 3 recently. What?
Yeah, spatial extent did not change.
And I think it hangs off of the geographic extent, and it's a way to bring the vertical extent and the geographical extent together.
Yeah, vertical extent is off of geographic, off of.
Spatial extent. Okay, so it's important to know the time and the place.
So that's fine, so then therefore, it doesn't seem like in this visual extended section of the vertical required.
Well, also remember that we can make things, a required or an optional or, different levels of the recommendation. So could be what extent?
Yes, vertical extent is completely separate. Right off of the extent. So, I think questions like the shared vocabularies that you mentioned for format names or format versions, or questions like if you're in a situation like, an atmospheric kind of a set of measurements or ocean measurements or where vertical is important, then you could have that vertical element in your. We've talked about sort of menus of checks where you might say, oh, this is important for my. Yeah. Right. In your community, vertical extent can be very important. Yeah. And we can get an XPath for that. It might even be in the glossary. I haven't looked at the glossary for a while. Yeah, and instead of geographic extent, you have vertical extent, which is their one of the main. They're a little bit out of their main. Yeah.
Okay, so we said vertical extent, and then what was the other one? Oh, okay.
Is there, if it's super accurate, is there something that's less accurate or is everything super accurate?
Well, the problem is most of the verticals that I find, their reference systems is like level or whatever, but it doesn't know that it's bad. I feel like amendment already.
But I think the coordinate reference system in this case will also tell you whether depth is positive or depth is negative.
Oh yeah, that's fine, but they're small.
It helps if you limit it to just the actual like coordinate reference system within ESG and not try to get hung up on data.
I couldn't find one that was actually.
I pretty much know what issues about implementing this one, so like I get it. It's painful to start out.
So then would coordinates reference system be something that we would want to add?
No, sorry,
I don't think you need to go that far. This one. There is a vertical.
Well, but you said that the vertical extent is difficult to,
Oh, I was saying like. Oh, no, you're now putting the reference system right. As soon as you have a reference system, you have to have a reference system right. The code and that.
well, so, but if you have to have it, then it would be something that would make it more usable, right?
well, yeah, that, like it tells you your starting point for your new max values.
But would it be,
It tells you the units of reference for your min max values. It gives you a whole bunch of information on that. Just having a like 5 and 15 don't
Right. There's nowhere else to say like your computers or.
okay, so just looking at a vertical extent wouldn't be sufficient then? You would need to also have that.
This information is contained within the vertical extent. So in order for the vertical extent to be compliant with the ISO schema,
I,
it needs to have CRS, min value, and max value.
okay, oh, golly. Yeah, it's so huge on my screen and then so small on this screen.
You're right, it is optional.
That would be required.
You're right, it's not required, but then you have to do that.
So this reference system info element is under the vertical extent, or is it?
No, well,
Yeah, vertical extent and vertical
so the reference system information appears in two distinct places in the ISO. It hangs off of the MD metadata class. That's sort of this is the reference system for your data set. And then within the vertical extent itself, you can also specify the reference system specific to your vertical extent.
Okay.
Yeah, so you've got the one that's coming, you know, the slash star slash is something that's coming right off of the root. So that's the reference system info class, which has a little bit more than just an identifier. But then in the vertical extent, you can also have an identifier for a reference system.
Okay.
So it's got a path that goes down through data info and
So then would it be possible for someone to write their coordinates reference system there and then not have it as a part of the vertical extent and it still be a valid record? I mean, because we need to cover all of the bases, right? If this information might be somewhere else that's not a child element of vertical extent, then
In my experience, even in NOAA, there are very few records that have much either vertical extent or information about vertical coordinate references. It's been a while since I've looked at it. But in UNAVCO, you've got a lot of coordinate references. It's like what you guys do. So you know, there are a lot of elements that could, like the depth of the ocean could be important in certain communities and critical in other communities. So, you know, if you, in terms of the name of this concept, you might have one which is the coordinate reference system, which is the XHAT that you've got there. Then you might have one which is vertical coordinate reference system. That would be another. It's sort of a different concept, maybe. And either one of them could, you know. Then the other question is, how do you want to have conditional tests where if you have a vertical extent, then you must have this thing, or you know, or this thing would be something that you look for.
I guess if one of the vertical, here, how do you see this?
Well, I would say they mean nothing. They have a multiple set of concepts.
According to the written page, it's a conditional way. So you either have vertical CRS, I believe, which points to empty reference system, or you have vertical CRS, which points to the CRS class. But I don't believe there is much kind of information on what the CRS class actually is.
are you talking about the GeoIDE ISO Explorer wiki?
So that's sorry. I'm sorry. I keep thinking part one. So I'm looking at the ESIP wiki page.
Oh, okay.
It's slightly different than the GeoIDE.
Yes, yes. But still the ISO Explorer?
It's the ISO Explorer for the updated version of the standard.
Yes, okay. Not the original ISO Explorer, but the ISO Explorer -1, we'll call it. Okay. So then I guess what I'm hearing is that this is a specific information need for a set of users, but perhaps not essential for a generic ESIP community user. I mean, I'm asking. You feel free to disagree. Okay. Well, I mean, oceans are a big part of the earth, right? They cover how much of the earth?
And I think you could have a test for every element like, and then the communities could select whatever element they need. So I think one of the things that we discussed in the last couple of sessions is community specific needs. So there are going to be people in ESIP and maybe ocean people. They could be atmospheric atmospheric composition control to say without altitude or depth, or net CDF even, without altitude or depth, this metadata is useless.
Well, I mean, it
So,
sounds like you just described about 2/3 to 3/4 of the community.
well, yeah, some significant portion, I would say. But yeah, so I mean, if someone says, in my community, we need depth, we need vertical extent, and if we need for the numbers to be meaningful and understand what the coordinate system is for them, then both of those things should be tests that somehow could be selected.
And I know specific harvesters that want to be able to harvest things on production below 600 liters.
Harvesters
Oh, wow.
searches or something.
Well, like say like
And another, interesting thing, for instance, is, if you're looking for these paths and you're looking through, a significant collection of metadata, it's interesting to know how often that actually gets used.
if you're going to like some kind of foreign river, you have to like vertical extent you usually have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, atmosphere and oceans are a huge part of what ESIP as a community investigates, right?
Well, even outside of the ESIP, like strongly defined earth science community, like we deal a lot with terrestrial and marine ecology. There's still heights and depths, and unless you have your CRS, you can't do it. It's important in general if you're just talking about the location of something, whether below the concept of CRS is baffling outside of the ESIP community. Like the oceanographers get it when you spend time with them, the ecologists like you have to code it, get them something up more term. But like the need for that is universal.
Yeah. And I guess, if you find a record that doesn't have that thing and it's a oceanography or it's an atmospheric data set and it doesn't have that thing, then it's going to be less interoperable.
It could potentially be unusable.
Yeah, right.
There's been a handful of instances in fisheries where they've collected data, and then they've forgotten to calibrate the data against their coordinate reference system, and so now they have a bunch of numbers with no context to them, which is a horrible situation to be in.
And creates unfair data.
It's unusable. There, this, like, real world instance, spent a bunch of money to go collect a bunch of data, forgot to record the coordinate reference system for the data, so they had no idea. They had no context to any of the actual, like, depth measurements in the data. They just had numbers. And so they ended up having to spend a whole bunch more money to do a bunch of data analysis to try to reconstruct the data collected in like similar locations to figure out what the actual like starting point for all of the numbers.
Just to try and salvage.
On this glossary page, you search for vertical. There are a bunch of different concepts that include vertical max, vertical min. On this glossary page.
This is a glossary page. If you look on that Google Doc, there are a series of links to glossaries for a few different standards. And we're on the ISO one. Yeah, so we've got
Is this different than just the glossary, which is on ESIP Wiki?
this glossary is on the ESIP wiki, but it is standards or dialect specific. This one is, yeah.
The one on the ESIP Wiki is what I'm looking at, and there are a number of different vertical things.
Yeah, so I think that we have all of the, on this page, have all of the ones that have an ISO XPath. So if there might be some in the glossary, although I would guess not. Well, yeah, because we want to be able to grab this XPath and then put it into a dictionary to use in the workflow to get a report. But I think if we've got the extent and we've got the coordinate reference system, then we know whether we're going to be able to, and is reuse or interoperate. And
Yeah, they're all related. I'd argue for moving into the find section. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of noise. Yeah. I mean, it sort of goes down. It's the same with like your geographic extent, right? Like important for discovering, but it's also like important for reuse.
so what if we consider vertical extent findable and then the coordinate reference system as reuse or interoperate? I mean, does that seem like it works? What I will do is add them as issues, and then we'll decide, you know, if it's going to make it into the data one. I mean, because they have a different set of users, a different set of needs, but what you can definitely do is use it in the workflow in the notebooks on your own metadata to see if what you're producing is fair for your community. Because if you can identify records that don't contain those concepts, then you've identified records that as a curator you would want to address, take a look at, and see whether, you know, it's possible for you to improve that thing. Because then you're making that data set, as we decided, more findable and more interoperable, you know, or reusable. We're not sure if we decided which section we wanted to stick that one in. But I mean, that's really the value of setting up these automated systems, right? Is that you can say, okay, I run this against my entire catalog, and oh, I discover these records that don't have, you know, this concept that I've determined we need for making that thing findable, or we need that thing for making it reusable. And, you know, when we can look over our entire catalog of thousands of records and pull out the 100 that don't have that thing, and we can look at those things and see if we actually do have the metadata that we can add to those records and then make that thing findable and usable. And if we start tying that into you know, metrics about how often those things are cited, then we can really start to you know, create some good data that we can show to funders that say, hey, we actually do need systems like this. We actually do need to continually curate these records throughout the data lifecycle. So let's go ahead and add coordinates reference system.
There's no reason why you couldn't have, you know, five elements of your classification. Like one is FAIR, and the fifth one is other stuff where we're not really sure where it goes, but we know it's important. Right? And, you know, how these tests are classified is an interesting discussion, and it could vary from community to community. And it's not something that if I was working with community on this and they wanted it to be in R, that's fine with me. I don't, you know, it's where these things get classified is really sort of an academic, I don't know what the right word for it is, but it's really won't worry too much about where they actually go in FAIR, because we know that the FAIR is not a stripe of black and white and black and white. It's like sort of a gray mass. And
So having gone through the exercise and things like that, it might be important to not just call it other things, but to, if some people want to multiple FMRI, and we have to say it wants multiple FMRI categories. That way,
yeah, that's fine. I mean, I'm not going to be in a religious situation on this, on the classification and things. That's like that. You know, if you want to have the same test in multiple classes, that's great. I mean, or multiple letters, that's fine with me. The only thing that you have to be careful, then I mean, when we did the original, NOAA rubrics, part of the idea was to break it up into pieces that a metadata manager could sort of deal with in some amount of time that was reasonable. So we could decide in our data center or our project, we were going to work on one of these sets of things for a week or something like that. And so you may in the data site stuff that I'm doing, I have two different sets of things that are findable. They're both findable. One's sort of like really important findable, and one's sort of supporting kind of findable. So an identifier goes in really important, and maybe what schema that identifier comes from is in supporting stuff. So that kind of, or a URI for vocabulary might be sort of supporting information that's nice. But it's sort of in the the current implementation of the NOAA. Yeah, there's like the extra credit stuff. There's some things into more and more classes, and that whatever works for you and your workflow and your community is the right answer from my point of view.
Yeah, and I think, there are examples from previous recommendations that have concepts that appear in multiple concerns, we'll call them, levels. Catalog services for the web. There are many things that are a core queryable that are also a core returnable. So, and you only need to do one test and then just write it out in the report a couple of times, right? So at the end of the day, we're trying to make things fair and not just accessible or findable. We are over time. I don't want to eat into your break anymore than I have. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that you're able to utilize this workflow to look at your own community's metadata and as a quick and lightweight way to determine and create reports that you can hopefully use to show people the importance of your work. Thanks, guys.